On the morning of March the 3rd, 1958, a delivery truck driver named Holt Eberly turned off the county highway and onto the two-lane road that led into Aldridge Hollow, a small town tucked into a fold of valley land in the northern reaches of a sparsely populated county, the kind of place most maps barely bothered to label. He'd made this same run twice a week for nearly 6 years, hauling dry goods and feed supplies to the general store on Aldridge Hollow's modest main street, and he knew the rhythm of that town the way you know the rhythm of a place you've watched wake up 100 times before. The lights would already be on in the diner by the time he arrived. Old Man Pruitt would be out sweeping the steps of the hardware store. Somebody's dog would bark at the truck the way it always did, every single week, never quite used to the sound of his engine despite years of hearing it. That morning had begun, by his own later account, like any other. He'd left the depot before dawn, the way he always did on his Aldridge Hollow run, taking the same series of turns off the highway he could have driven blind by that point in his career, his mind occupied with nothing more pressing than the usual mental tally of what needed unloading first, which deliveries would take longest, whether he'd make it back to the depot in time for lunch the way he liked to most Mondays. He noticed the morning fog sitting unusually thick in the valley as he came down off the ridge road that overlooked the town, thicker than he remembered it typically settling at that hour, though he would later tell investigators he hadn't thought much of it at the time, weather in that valley being notoriously unpredictable given the particular geography of the surrounding hills. That morning, none of it happened. He noticed it first as an absence of sound, he would say later, in the handful of interviews he ever gave on the subject before he stopped giving them altogether. No dog barked, no screen door slapped shut. The town simply sat there in the gray early light, silent in a way that struck him, even before he'd fully processed what he was looking at, as fundamentally wrong, the silence of a held breath, rather than the ordinary quiet of a sleepy town at 6 in the morning. He parked his truck in its usual spot outside the general store and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, he said, before he could make himself get out, because something about the stillness of the street in front of him felt, in his own words, like walking into somebody's photograph instead of somebody's town. He has described, in those same rare interviews, the particular quality of light that morning, gray and flat, and somehow too even, without the ordinary play of shadow and motion that even a quiet street typically holds. No curtain stirring in any window, no thread of smoke rising from any chimney, despite the early March chill that should, by his own reckoning, have had at least a few households already stoking their morning fires. He recalled noticing, with a kind of creeping unease he couldn't yet attach to anything specific, that even the town's single traffic signal, a blinking caution light at the main intersection, installed only a few years before, was still blinking its steady amber rhythm into an empty street, cycling through its mechanical sequence for no one at all. The general store door was unlocked, the way it always was by that hour. The proprietor, a woman named Edna Caswell, typically already behind the counter sorting the morning's deliveries. The lights inside were on. The coffee pot on the back counter was full, still faintly warm according to Holt's later account, though he admitted he might have imagined the warmth in the panic of what came after, might have simply wanted there to be some trace of recent human presence to hold on to. Edna was nowhere in the building. Her apron hung on its usual hook by the register. A ledger lay open on the counter, a column of figures half completed in pencil, the pencil itself resting beside the open page, exactly where a hand might set it down between one entry and the next. Holt Eberly walked out of that store and down the center of Aldridge Hollow's main street, calling out names, he said, names of people he knew, people whose orders he'd been delivering for years, and the only thing that answered him was his own voice coming back at him off the storefronts. He has described that walk down the street, in the few accounts he gave before his death many years later, as the longest few minutes of his life. Longer, he said, than anything he experienced overseas during the war, because at least in those moments he'd understood what kind of danger he was in. Walking down that empty street, he understood nothing at all, and that, he said, was its own particular kind of terror, one he never fully recovered from. By the time county authorities reached Aldridge Hollow later that same morning, alerted by Holt's frantic call from a roadside telephone several miles back toward the highway, the scope of what had happened was already becoming apparent in a way that defied easy comprehension. Aldridge Hollow, by the most recent county records, had a population of 381 residents as of the previous autumn's count. Every single one of them was gone, not relocated, not visibly harmed, not accounted for in any way investigators could determine. Simply gone, between some point the previous evening and the gray hour of that March morning, leaving behind a town that looked, in nearly every particular, exactly as it should have looked with its people still in it. To understand why this disappearance unsettled investigators and, eventually, an entire region, in a way that few events before or since have managed to match, it helps to understand what kind of place Aldridge Hollow actually was, because there was nothing about the town itself that suggested any reason for what happened to it. It was not isolated in any extreme sense, not some forgotten settlement cut off from the wider world. It sat roughly 11 miles from the county seat, connected by a paved road that saw regular traffic, served by its own small post office, its own one-room schoolhouse that had, by 1958, grown into a proper two-story building with 4 teachers and roughly 90 students. The town had been founded in the 1870s around a modest but productive vein of mining activity in the surrounding hills, copper mostly, with a little silver, and though the mining had tapered off considerably by the 1930s, the town had settled into a quieter, more agricultural rhythm by the time of its disappearance, sustained by small farms in the surrounding valley, a lumber operation that employed perhaps 40 men, and the ordinary commercial activity of any small American town of that era. A general store, a hardware store, a diner, a small Baptist church and a smaller Methodist one a few blocks over, a barber shop, a single gas station at the edge of town where the county road came in. The rhythms of daily life in Aldridge Hollow, reconstructed afterward through interviews with surviving relatives, with the handful of residents who happened to be away on the night of the disappearance, and with neighbors in adjacent communities who had regular contact with the town, painted a picture of a place defined by an almost unremarkable steadiness. The general store opened at 6 each morning and closed at 6 in the evening, 6 days a week, with Sunday reserved, as in most towns of its era and region, for church and rest. The diner served breakfast starting at 5:30 for the men heading out to the lumber operation and stayed open through a modest dinner service most evenings, run for nearly 2 decades by the same family, the Hargroves, whose recipes for biscuits and gravy were apparently well known enough to draw the occasional traveler off the county highway, specifically to eat there. The schoolhouse let out at 3 each afternoon, and in the warmer months, the town's children could reliably be found afterward down by the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town, fishing or simply wading in the shallows, a detail several surviving relatives mentioned with particular tenderness in later interviews. The kind of small, ordinary detail that becomes almost unbearably poignant once you know what eventually happened to the children who used to gather there. The town held a modest social calendar typical of its size and era, a harvest festival each autumn that drew visitors from several surrounding communities, a 4th of July celebration centered on the small park behind the schoolhouse, regular potluck suppers organized by the Baptist congregation that, by several accounts, the Methodist families attended just as readily, despite the technical denominational divide, since in a town that size, the practical bonds of neighborliness tended to matter more than doctrinal distinctions. Several longtime residents of the county seat, interviewed decades later for various retrospective accounts of the case, described Aldridge Hollow in terms that, taken together, suggest a town that had achieved a kind of settled, durable ordinariness, neither thriving nor declining in any dramatic sense, simply continuing, year after year, in the way small rural towns across that region continued through the middle decades of the 20th century, weathering the gradual decline of the mining industry that had founded it by finding other, steadier sources of livelihood, adjusting without much apparent friction to the slow modernization that reached even remote communities in the post-war years. Electricity had come to Aldridge Hollow in the early 1940s, telephone service not long after, a handful of households even owning television sets by 1958, though reception in that hilly terrain remained notoriously unreliable. By every account gathered afterward from surrounding communities, Aldridge Hollow was, in the plainest sense of the word, unremarkable. It had no particular reputation, good or bad, beyond the ordinary regional familiarity any small town earns simply by existing alongside its neighbors for decades. People in the county seat knew Aldridge Hollow the way you know a town you pass through occasionally, vaguely, fondly in some cases, without much specific thought given to it beyond practical matters of commerce and family connection. Several families in the county seat had relatives in Aldridge Hollow, cousins, in-laws, the ordinary web of kinship that connects small communities to one another in rural regions where people don't move around much across generations. This meant that when the disappearance was confirmed, the shock did not stay contained within Aldridge Hollow's own borders. It rippled outward immediately, into dozens of families in surrounding towns who suddenly found themselves unable to account for a sister, an uncle, a childhood friend, anyone who had happened to be living in or visiting Aldridge Hollow on the night in question. The investigation that began that morning would eventually become one of the most thoroughly documented unsolved disappearances in the region's history, drawing in county sheriff's deputies within hours, state police investigators by the following day, and, within a week, attention from federal agencies whose precise involvement has never been fully clarified in any public record, a detail that would itself become a significant thread in the decades of speculation that followed. But in those first hours, before any of that wider apparatus arrived, what greeted the handful of county deputies who first drove into Aldridge Hollow that March morning was a scene that several of them would describe, in reports filed over the following days, in language unusually candid for official law enforcement documentation, language that betrayed how deeply the scene had unsettled even men accustomed to difficult and disturbing circumstances in the course of their work. The deputies found homes unlocked, in most cases, doors standing open or simply unlatched, the way people leave their doors in small towns, where locking up isn't a habit anyone bothers with. Inside those homes, life appeared to have simply paused mid-motion. In one house, a kettle sat on a stovetop, the burner beneath it cold by the time deputies arrived, but with a residue inside suggesting it had been recently used, water boiled down to a thin film at the bottom. In another, a half-eaten breakfast sat on a kitchen table, eggs and toast gone cold, a coffee cup beside it, with a faint ring at the bottom, where the liquid had evaporated away over the preceding hours. Beds in many homes were found unmade, sheets thrown back the way a person leaves them when they intend to return to finish sleeping, rather than the tucked, deliberate appearance of a bed made up for the day. In the schoolhouse, found unlocked like nearly every other building in town, chalk sat in the trays beneath blackboards on which partial lessons remained written, mid-sentence in some classrooms. A long division problem worked halfway through on another board. The chalk itself found on the floor beneath it, as though it had simply slipped from someone's hand. Vehicles remained parked exactly where their owners would ordinarily have left them overnight, in driveways, alongside the curb on Main Street, in the small gravel lot behind the church. None were missing. The town's single gas station, which kept careful records of its limited fuel inventory given the rationing habits that had carried over from wartime economics, even more than a decade after the war's end, showed no unusual activity in the days before the disappearance, no sudden rush of departures that might explain an empty town through ordinary, voluntary evacuation. The lumber operations equipment sat idle at the work site outside town, tools laid down mid-task in a few cases, according to the foreman's own report once he was eventually located and interviewed. He had, by chance, been away visiting family in another county on the night in question, one of the only Aldridge Hollow residents confirmed to have survived the event simply by virtue of having not been present for it. Individual accounts collected from deputies and, later, from the small number of journalists permitted limited access to the town in those first chaotic days add further texture to just how thoroughly ordinary the scene appeared, frozen in place, in nearly every home investigators entered. In the home belonging to a family named Holcomb, deputies found a sewing basket open on a chair beside a half-mended shirt, the needle still threaded, resting across the fabric exactly where a hand might set it down to answer a knock at the door, or attend to some brief interruption before returning to finish the work. In another home, belonging to an elderly widow named Vesta Tillman, who lived alone at the edge of town, deputies found a radio left on, tuned to a regional station, still playing faintly when they entered, though by the time investigators thought to check, no one could determine with certainty how long it had been running, since battery-powered sets of that era could operate for extended periods without attention. In the home of the town's barber, a man named Cyrus Doane, deputies found his straight razor laid out on a folded towel beside a basin of water gone cold, as though he had been midway through his own evening shave, when whatever happened, happened. The town's small medical office, staffed part-time by a doctor who traveled a circuit between several rural communities and happened, by further coincidence of timing that investigators noted with some unease, to have been in Aldridge Hollow that very evening for his regular Tuesday visiting hours, was found with its waiting room chairs arranged in the loose, scattered configuration of recent use, 2 patient charts left out on the front desk, appointments apparently still in progress or recently concluded. The doctor himself, like the lumber foreman, was never accounted for among the missing in the conventional sense, because, as it turned out through careful reconstruction of his known schedule, he should have departed Aldridge Hollow sometime around 8 that evening to return to his home in a neighboring town, and the question of whether he had, in fact, left before whatever happened, or whether he had simply lingered later than his usual schedule and become one more name added to the list of the vanished, was never definitively resolved, since no one in his hometown could confirm with certainty whether he had returned that night or not, his own household having assumed, when he failed to come home, that he had simply decided to stay over in Aldridge Hollow as he occasionally did during difficult weather, an assumption that, by the time anyone thought to question it, could no longer be verified one way or the other. Perhaps most unsettling to the investigators who first walked through that town, more than the unfinished meals or the unmade beds, was the presence of the town's animals. Dogs were found, in nearly every case, still tied or penned exactly where their owners would have left them for the night, alive, agitated, hungry, by the time anyone got around to feeding them, but otherwise unharmed and, crucially, present, when their owners were not. Chickens in coops behind several homes were found alive and undisturbed. A small herd of dairy cattle belonging to one of the outlying farms was found in its pasture the following day, having gone unmilked for what investigators estimated to be roughly 18 hours, distressed by the discomfort of it but physically unharmed. This detail, more than almost any other, would come to occupy a particular and lasting place in the public imagination around the Aldridge Hollow case, because it spoke to something that resisted nearly every theory investigators would eventually try to apply to the disappearance. Whatever had happened to the people of that town had happened to the people specifically, and had left behind, untouched and apparently unbothered, every living creature that was not human. One deputy, in a report whose unusually candid tone has been cited repeatedly by later researchers as evidence of just how deeply the scene had affected even seasoned law enforcement personnel, wrote that he had stood for several minutes outside a small home on the edge of town, watching a dog tied to the porch rail simply sitting, calm, watching him approach with the ordinary mild curiosity of any dog meeting a stranger, showing none of the distress or wariness he would have expected from an animal that had witnessed anything violent or frightening happen to the people it belonged to. If something had come for them in the night, he wrote, you would expect the dogs to know it. You would expect them to have barked themselves hoarse, or to be cowering, or to show some sign at all that anything out of the ordinary had occurred in their presence. Instead, they simply waited, the way a dog waits for its owner to come home from an errand, with no apparent understanding that anything was wrong at all. This observation, echoed independently by several other searchers and investigators in the days that followed, became one of the case's most frequently cited and most genuinely puzzling details, because it suggested, however speculatively, that whatever had happened to Aldrich Hollow's human population had occurred without producing the kind of fear response that even unsophisticated animal observers would ordinarily be expected to register. The scale of the search that followed was, for its era and for a county with limited resources, extraordinary. Within the first week, more than 200 searchers had combed the surrounding hills and forest, the same terrain that had once supported the town's mining operations decades before, riddled with old shafts and adits that investigators worried might have collapsed, trapping residents in some catastrophic but explicable accident that simply hadn't yet been discovered. Several of these old mine entries were investigated directly, a handful even partially excavated where structural concerns allowed, and nothing was found in any of them beyond the ordinary debris of decades of disuse. Dogs trained for search and rescue work, borrowed from a state agency given the scale of the effort required, were brought in within the first 10 days and found no trace, no scent trail leading away from the town in any direction, a detail the lead search coordinator described in his own report as more troubling than a body would have been, because a scent trail, however faint, would at least have offered investigators somewhere to go. Its absence offered nothing at all. The search effort itself, as it expanded over those first weeks, drew volunteers from across the region. Men and women who had no direct connection to Aldrich Hollow, but who felt compelled, by the sheer scale and strangeness of what had occurred, to contribute whatever labor they could to the effort, walking grid patterns through forest and pasture alike, checking culverts and dry creek beds and abandoned barns, anywhere a person or a group of people might conceivably have ended up, whether through their own movement or through some agency investigators couldn't yet name. Local churches across the county organized to feed and house the volunteer searchers, a logistical effort that itself became, in later retrospective accounts of the case, a kind of secondary story, a portrait of an entire region mobilizing around a tragedy that touched nearly everyone in it in some indirect way. Through some thread of family or friendship or simple shared regional identity that made Aldrich Hollow's disappearance feel, to nearly everyone in the county, like something that had happened not to strangers but to neighbors. Newspapers from across the state and, within a few weeks, from considerably further afield, sent reporters to cover the unfolding search, producing a body of contemporaneous press coverage that has itself become a valuable resource for later researchers, preserving details and witness impressions that might otherwise have faded from memory before anyone thought to formally document them. Several of these early reporters noted, in pieces filed during those first weeks, a quality to the gathered crowd of searchers and onlookers that struck them as distinct from the atmosphere typically surrounding other large-scale missing persons searches they had covered in their careers. A kind of subdued, almost reverent quiet that settled over the search effort within days of its beginning, as though the sheer scale and strangeness of what had occurred had stripped away the more ordinary energy of urgency and hope that usually animates such efforts, replacing it with something closer to solemn, collective bewilderment, a community going through the motions of search and rescue, while privately, many of them, already suspecting that whatever they were searching for would never actually be found. The investigation's working theories, in roughly the order they were proposed and pursued over the following months and years, give a clear picture of how thoroughly the case resisted every conventional explanation investigators tried to apply to it. The earliest and most immediately appealing theory, the one local authorities pursued hardest in those first frantic days, was some form of organized but unexplained evacuation, the idea that the town's residents had, for reasons not yet understood, left voluntarily and in coordination with one another, perhaps in response to some threat or warning that hadn't yet reached investigators, perhaps relocating somewhere as a body, taking only what they could carry, and leaving the rest of their lives behind, out of urgent necessity. This theory ran aground almost immediately against the same evidence that made the disappearance so strange in the first place. People do not evacuate in the middle of breakfast, leaving eggs on the table and coffee cooling in cups. They do not evacuate leaving their vehicles parked in their driveways, their livestock untended, their dogs tied to porches where they'll starve without intervention. A coordinated, deliberate evacuation, however urgent, leaves traces of deliberation. Packed bags, closed accounts, some pattern of departure investigators could trace through the roads leading away from town. None of that was found. The roads leading into and out of Aldridge Hollow showed no unusual traffic patterns in the days before or the night of the disappearance. According to the limited but consistent testimony of residents in neighboring communities who would have noticed any significant movement of vehicles or people along those routes, particularly given how few people traveled those rural roads after dark in that era. Investigators pursued this evacuation theory further than the physical evidence alone might have justified, in part because it was, of every theory eventually considered, by far the most psychologically comfortable, offering the possibility that the town's residents might still be alive somewhere, relocated under duress or coercion, but fundamentally intact, findable if only investigators could trace the right thread. State police circulated descriptions and photographs of missing residents to law enforcement agencies across several neighboring states in the weeks following the disappearance. A substantial undertaking for the era, requiring considerable coordination given the limitations of interstate communication available to rural agencies in 1958. This effort produced, over the following months, a steady trickle of false leads. Reported sightings in distant towns, a handful of cases where someone bearing a passing resemblance to a missing Aldridge Hollow resident was located, interviewed, and confirmed to be someone else entirely. An unrelated person whose only connection to the case was an unfortunate physical similarity to a photograph circulated in a newspaper or law enforcement bulletin. Not one of these leads, across the full span of the investigation's active years, ever resulted in the confirmed identification of a single Aldridge Hollow resident found alive anywhere outside the town. A second theory, pursued with considerable seriousness by state investigators in the months that followed, centered on the possibility of some environmental or industrial catastrophe. A gas leak, perhaps, originating from the old mining operations beneath the town. Something capable of incapacitating, or even killing the entire population, quickly and silently enough that no one had time to raise an alarm, with the bodies themselves subsequently removed by whatever process had caused the disaster, or simply not yet found despite extensive searching. This theory had the appeal of offering a mechanism, however grim, for how an entire town's population could vanish without obvious signs of struggle or panic. Investigators brought in mining engineers and geological surveyors to assess the old shafts beneath and around the town, testing for gas pockets, structural instability, anything that might support the theory. They found aging, partially collapsed tunnels consistent with decades of disuse, but no evidence of any gas leak severe enough to account for what had happened, and crucially, no evidence that could explain the survival, entirely unaffected, of the town's animal population, which would presumably have been equally vulnerable to any airborne toxin capable of incapacitating the human residents. A toxicologist consulted later in the investigation noted, in a report that has been quoted often in subsequent retellings of the case, that he was unaware of any environmental agent capable of selectively affecting human physiology while leaving dogs, cattle, and chickens entirely unharmed, and that absent such an agent, the environmental theory simply could not account for the evidence as it stood. This same toxicologist, in a follow-up section of his report that has drawn renewed interest from later researchers, noted that he had also examined the question of whether any naturally occurring or industrially produced substance might selectively target human neurological function in a way that could produce sudden, simultaneous incapacitation without immediate physical harm, a line of inquiry he pursued largely to be thorough rather than because he expected to find anything, given how speculative such a mechanism would have to be by the standards of toxicological science available in 1958. He concluded that field was simply too undeveloped at the time to either confirm or rule out such a possibility with any real confidence, a limitation he noted candidly in his own report, writing that, "The present state of the science does not allow me to say with certainty that no such mechanism exists, only that I am aware of none documented or understood well enough to propose as an explanation here." This careful, qualified uncertainty, rather than any firm conclusion, has continued to leave a narrow door open in the case's evidentiary record that later, more speculative researchers have sometimes tried to walk through, generally without much success in producing anything more concrete than the toxicologist's original, honest admission of the limits of what could be known. The mining engineers' survey, conducted over nearly 6 weeks in the spring and early summer of 1958, did surface one detail that has continued to draw attention from later researchers, even though it was never folded into any conclusive theory at the time. Several of the older shafts beneath the town, dating back to the earliest decades of the mining operation in the 1870s and 1880s, showed evidence of more recent disturbance than the engineers had expected to find in tunnels officially abandoned and sealed off for the better part of 70 years. Fresh rockfall in places, areas where support timbers appeared to have failed relatively recently rather than decades earlier, and, in one particularly deep shaft that the survey team explored only partially before deeming it too unstable to continue, the discovery of what the lead engineer's report described, with characteristic period understatement, as an unusual quantity of disturbed earth at the lowest accessible point, inconsistent with the natural settling expected in a passage sealed this long. The survey team did not have the resources or the institutional support to excavate that disturbed earth further, and the shaft itself was sealed permanently for safety reasons before any deeper investigation could be conducted, a decision that, in hindsight, several later researchers have characterized as a significant missed opportunity. Though it's worth noting that the engineers making that call in 1958 had no particular reason to suspect the disturbed earth was connected to the disappearance, rather than simply representing the ordinary, if somewhat more recent than expected, geological activity of an old and unstable mine. A third theory, which gained more traction in popular speculation than it ever did within the formal investigation itself, though it was nonetheless examined with some seriousness by at least one state investigator whose notes survive in the case file, proposed some form of religious or ideological movement. The idea that Aldridge Hollow's population had been drawn, collectively, into some kind of departure organized around shared belief, a theory that drew loosely on a handful of historical precedents involving small, isolated communities that had relocated en masse for religious reasons in earlier decades. This theory struggled against the same evidentiary problems as the evacuation theory more broadly, but it gained particular traction because of one detail that investigators noted early on and were never able to fully explain. The town's 2 churches, the Baptist congregation and the smaller Methodist one, both showed evidence of recent, ordinary use. Hymnals left open on pews, a sermon outline found on the pulpit of the Baptist church dated to the previous Sunday, nothing suggesting any unusual gathering or ceremony on the night in question. But in the Baptist church's small adjoining cemetery, investigators found something that has never been satisfactorily explained, and that continues to surface in nearly every retelling of the Aldridge Hollow story to this day. Several of the older grave markers, weathered stones dating back to the town's founding decades, were found disturbed, not exhumed exactly. No evidence of digging, but tilted, several of them, at angles inconsistent with simple decades of ground settling, as though something had pushed against them from beneath, or as though they had been deliberately, carefully shifted and then left in their new positions. No explanation was ever offered for this detail in any official record, and it has remained, for decades, one of the case's most persistently unsettling and unresolved threads. The investigator who examined this religious or cult-based theory most seriously, a state police detective named Holloway, whose case notes survive more completely than most of the original investigative documentation, spent several weeks interviewing the Baptist congregation's pastor's surviving family. The pastor himself, a man named Reverend Aldous Crane, had vanished along with his entire congregation, but his adult daughter, who had moved away from Aldridge Hollow some years before to attend a teacher's college in a distant city, was located and interviewed extensively. She described her father, in testimony that survives in Holloway's notes, as a deeply conventional and unremarkable man theologically, uninterested in anything resembling the kind of charismatic or apocalyptic preaching that might suggest a congregation primed for some collective departure, and she rejected outright any suggestion that her father might have led his congregation into anything resembling a coordinated act of self-removal from ordinary life. Holloway's own notes, in a passage that has been quoted in several later academic treatments of the case, conclude that he found no credible evidence supporting the religious theory beyond the unexplained cemetery anomaly, and that he considered the theory, on balance, the least likely of the explanations so far proposed, kept alive primarily by the unsettling coincidence of the disturbed grave markers rather than by any substantive evidence of organized religious motive. A fourth theory, the one that has perhaps generated the most enduring public fascination in the decades since, involves rumors of military or government involvement. Rumors that began circulating almost immediately after the disappearance became public knowledge, and that have never been definitively confirmed or refuted, in part because of genuine gaps in the available historical record from that period. Gaps that conspiracy-minded researchers have long pointed to as evidence of deliberate concealment, and that more measured historians have generally attributed to the ordinary administrative chaos and incomplete record-keeping common to rural county and state agencies in that era. What is verifiable, through county records and the recollections of several surviving witnesses interviewed decades later, is that federal personnel did arrive in the area within roughly a week of the disappearance becoming known, identifying themselves, according to the limited local testimony available, only generally as representatives of an unspecified federal agency conducting an independent assessment of the situation. Their presence in the county lasted, by most accounts, somewhere between 10 days and 2 weeks, during which time several local witnesses reported restricted access to portions of the search area, particularly the stretch of hills closest to the town's old mining operations, an area that had, up to that point, been open to the volunteer search effort, but that was, for a period of roughly 4 days during the federal presence, closed off entirely, with local searchers turned away and given only vague explanations about safety concerns related to unstable mine shafts. Several surviving witnesses interviewed decades later, by then elderly themselves but still able to recall the period with reasonable clarity, described the federal personnel's presence in terms that emphasized just how unusual and disquieting their conduct seemed at the time, even setting aside the specific question of restricted access. One man, who had been a teenager helping with the volunteer search effort in 1958, recalled in an interview given more than 50 years later that the federal personnel arrived in vehicles without any visible agency markings, wore civilian clothing rather than any recognizable uniform, and conducted their own activities in the area with a notable lack of coordination or communication with the local sheriff's department, a detail that struck even the local deputies as unusual, given how thoroughly federal and state cooperation typically governed major investigations even in that era. They didn't talk to anybody, he recalled. They didn't explain what they were looking for, didn't ask us what we'd found, didn't seem interested in anything the rest of us had been doing for the better part of a week already. They just went up into those hills with their own equipment, stayed up there however many days it was, and then left. And nobody local ever heard another word about what they found, if they found anything at all. This restriction, brief as it was, has become one of the central pillars of the more speculative theories that have grown up around the Aldridge Hollow case over the decades. Theories that range from the relatively grounded, suggestions that the federal involvement related to Cold War-era concerns about resource extraction, mineral surveys connected to early atomic research that had, in fact, drawn government interest to several mining regions across the country during that period, to the considerably more fantastical, including persistent rumors, never substantiated by any credible source, of unusual atmospheric or electromagnetic readings recorded in the area in the days surrounding the disappearance, rumors that seem to have originated from a single second-hand account given by a local rancher decades after the fact, an account that researchers have never been able to corroborate through any contemporary documentation, and that may represent nothing more than the kind of detail that accretes naturally around any unsolved mystery left to simmer in public memory for long enough. What can be said with greater confidence, based on the surviving documentary record, is that the federal personnel who visited the area in 1958 left without ever publicly clarifying the nature of their assessment, and that subsequent attempts by journalists and researchers in later decades to obtain clear records of that visit through official channels were met, consistently, with responses describing the relevant records as lost, incomplete, or, in a small number of cases, formally withheld under classifications that several researchers have argued seem disproportionate to what should have been, on its face, a routine missing persons matter, however large in scale. Whether this reflects genuine concealment of some significant finding, or simply the ordinary, frustrating opacity of mid-century federal bureaucracy when confronted with an unusual and embarrassing local tragedy that fell awkwardly between several agencies' jurisdictions, remains, like nearly everything else about this case, a matter of persistent and unresolved debate. The formal investigation into the disappearance of Aldrich Hollow's population continued, in various forms and with varying degrees of intensity, for the better part of 3 years following the initial discovery, gradually narrowing in scope as leads dried up, and the practical likelihood of finding any of the town's residents alive diminished with each passing season. The case was never officially closed in the sense of being declared solved. It was, instead, gradually deprioritized, the active search winding down by 1960, the case file transferred eventually to a kind of permanent cold case status that it has occupied ever since, periodically revisited by researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators, but never meaningfully advanced beyond the basic facts established in those first chaotic weeks. A fifth theory, considered more briefly than the others but worth noting for the particular character it lent to the case's later folklore, emerged roughly a year into the investigation, proposed initially by a regional newspaper columnist rather than by any formal investigator, though it gained enough public traction that state investigators felt compelled to formally address and dismiss it in their own subsequent reports. This theory suggested that Aldrich Hollow's disappearance might be connected to a string of unrelated, unexplained disappearances reported in scattered rural communities across several neighboring states over the preceding decade, smaller in scale, involving individual families or small groups rather than entire towns, but sharing, according to the columnist's argument, a similar quality of sudden, traceless vanishing without evidence of struggle or motive. Investigators who looked into this proposed connection found the comparison largely unconvincing on closer examination, noting that most of the cases the columnist had grouped together turned out, upon proper investigation, to have far more mundane explanations than initially reported. Domestic disputes resolved through quiet relocation, financial troubles prompting families to disappear from creditors rather than from any inexplicable force, the ordinary, sad churn of rural poverty and family breakdown that produced its own steady, unremarkable trickle of unexplained departures every year across that region, departures that had simply never drawn the kind of sustained public attention that Aldrich Hollow's far larger and far stranger disappearance inevitably attracted. The theory was formally set aside within the investigation's own internal assessment, though it has continued to surface periodically in more speculative popular treatments of the case, usually presented with considerably less of the original skepticism that state investigators applied to it at the time. In the years immediately following the disappearance, the town itself became a site of considerable local fascination and, eventually, a particular kind of dread that kept most people away from it entirely. The county initially maintained a token security presence at the town's edge, intended partly to deter looting of the considerable property left behind. Homes full of furniture, the general store's inventory, the contents of nearly 400 lives left sitting exactly as their owners had left them. And partly, according to at least one surviving account from a deputy who served on that detail, because there was a persistent, unofficial concern among investigators that whatever had happened might happen again, that leaving the town entirely unmonitored felt, to those who had to make the decision, like an unacceptable risk given how little anyone actually understood about what they were dealing with. That deputy, in a later interview given decades after his retirement, described his time on that security detail as among the strangest assignments of his entire career, not because anything overtly alarming occurred during his shifts, but because of the particular sustained discomfort of spending long hours alone at the edge of a town that should have held nearly 400 people and instead held nothing at all. He recalled developing, over the weeks of that assignment, an acute sensitivity to sound, to the particular way the town's silence seemed to carry differently than ordinary rural quiet. A heaviness to it he struggled, even decades later, to fully put into words, except to say that he had never once, across his entire subsequent career in law enforcement, felt as consistently and inexplicably uneasy as he had during those weeks standing watch at the edge of Aldridge Hollow, and that he had requested reassignment from the detail earlier than his scheduled rotation would have required, a request his superiors granted without much question, given how many of his fellow deputies had made similar requests during their own turns on that same assignment. That security presence dwindled over the following 2 years as funding and attention moved elsewhere, and by 1961, Aldridge Hollow sat essentially unguarded, its ownership status legally complicated by the fact that nearly 400 property owners had vanished without any of the normal legal processes, wills, probate, inheritance, that would ordinarily resolve questions of property following a death. The county eventually developed a legal framework for handling the situation, treating the disappearances, after a mandated waiting period, in a manner functionally similar to death in absentia, allowing surviving relatives in some cases to claim property. Though many homes in Aldridge Hollow had no surviving relatives to claim them at all, families that had lived in the town for generations with no remaining branch outside it. It was in this period, the early 1960s, as the town sat increasingly abandoned and legally unresolved, that the first wave of what might be called folk testimony began to accumulate, accounts from people in neighboring communities who claimed to have experienced things in or near Aldridge Hollow that defied easy explanation, accounts that exist in an uncertain space between genuine, unsettling experience and the kind of embellished local legend that naturally grows up around any abandoned place, with a dark history attached to it. A farmer whose land bordered the old town reported, in an account given to a regional newspaper in 1962, that he had on several occasions over the preceding 2 years heard what sounded distinctly like church bells ringing from the direction of the town's Baptist church late at night, despite the fact that the church's bell, according to county inventory records compiled during the property assessment process, had been removed and sold off years before, along with most of the church's other movable fixtures, by relatives who had inherited claim to whatever could be salvaged from the property. That same farmer, in a more extensive interview conducted some years later by the regional historian who would go on to compile the most thorough collection of Aldridge Hollow folklore, elaborated on his account in ways that added further texture to the original report. He described the sound not as a single, isolated incident, but as something he had heard on what he estimated to be perhaps 6 or 7 occasions over a roughly 2-year period, always at night, always sometime between 11 and 1 in the morning, never accompanied by any other sound or sign of activity from the direction of the town. No lights, No movement he could discern even when he occasionally worked up the nerve to walk closer to his property line and look out across the dark fields toward the silhouette of the old church. He stated, with what the historian described as evident reluctance, even decades after the fact, that on the final occasion he heard the sound, sometime in early 1964, it had seemed to him different from the previous occurrences, not a clean, rhythmic tolling, but something more uneven, almost frantic, before stopping abruptly mid-peal, and that this final instance had disturbed him enough that he never mentioned the matter again to anyone outside his immediate family until the historian's research project gave him, decades later, what he described as finally feeling like a legitimate occasion to discuss it. Other accounts, gathered more systematically by a regional historian who began documenting Aldridge Hollow folklore in the early 1970s, describe a recurring pattern of reported sightings near the old town's perimeter, figures glimpsed at a distance, standing in doorways or windows of homes that had stood empty for years, always too far away or too briefly seen to offer any reliable detail, always gone by the time anyone approached closely enough to investigate. One particularly detailed account, given by a young couple who had, against the better judgment of their own families, driven out to the abandoned town on a dare sometime in the late 1960s, described approaching the old schoolhouse at dusk and seeing, in an upper-story window that should by all accounts have looked out onto an empty, long-abandoned classroom, the unmistakable shape of several smaller figures, seated, arranged in rows, the unmistakable posture of children at their desks, visible for only a handful of seconds before the light shifted and the window returned to its ordinary, empty darkness. The couple, by their own account, did not investigate further, leaving the area immediately and, according to the woman's later testimony, never returning to that part of the county again for any reason, even decades later when invited to participate in the historian's broader documentation project, declining politely but firmly, stating only that some things were better left exactly where you found them. None of these accounts carry any evidentiary weight in the formal sense, and the historian who compiled them was careful, in her own published work on the subject, to frame them explicitly as folklore rather than evidence, noting the well-documented psychological tendency for abandoned places with traumatic histories to generate exactly this kind of testimony, regardless of what actually happened there. But she also noted, with what reads, even decades later, as genuine scholarly unease, the sheer consistency of certain details across accounts, given by people who had no apparent contact with one another, no shared source for the stories they were independently reporting, a consistency that, she wrote, does not prove anything supernatural occurred at Aldridge Hollow, but does suggest that whatever happened there left an impression on the surrounding region deep enough to generate remarkably uniform folklore across multiple, unconnected witnesses, which is itself a phenomenon worth taking seriously, even if its ultimate cause remains entirely mysterious. She documented one further category of testimony that she found, by her own admission, more difficult to dismiss than the visual sightings, precisely because of how mundane and how consistently described it was, across multiple, entirely unconnected accounts, collected over more than a decade of research. Several residents of the nearest surrounding communities, interviewed independently and decades apart from one another, described a specific and recurring auditory phenomenon associated with the area immediately around the old town, something they each, independently, described using almost identical language, a sound, heard occasionally and unpredictably by people traveling the county road that passed near the town's perimeter after dark, of what they each described as many voices, very faint, very far away, talking simultaneously in tones too low and too overlapping to make out any individual words, a sound several of them compared, again independently, to the indistinct murmur of a crowded room heard from far outside its walls. The historian noted that she had personally driven that stretch of road at night on more than a dozen occasions over the course of her research, and had never once heard anything resembling the sound described to her, a fact she included in her published work specifically to avoid overstating the phenomenon, while nonetheless noting that the sheer number of independent, consistent accounts she had gathered over the years made it, in her professional judgment as a historian, rather than as anyone qualified to assess paranormal claims, a piece of regional testimony, too consistent and too widespread to dismiss purely as coincidence or invention, whatever its ultimate explanation might eventually prove to be. The descendants of Aldridge Hollow's vanished population, scattered as they were across the wider region, and in many cases across the country as families relocated in the years following the disappearance, have maintained, collectively, a particular and complicated relationship with the case over the decades since. Several family associations formed in the years immediately following the disappearance, loose networks of relatives who had lost parents, siblings, children, extended family in the event, organizing periodic gatherings, advocating for continued investigation, eventually, in the 1970s, successfully lobbying for the placement of a memorial marker at the edge of what remained of the town, listing the names of all 381 residents confirmed to have vanished that night. A marker that stands, weathered now but still legible, at what was once the entrance to Aldridge Hollow's main street. These family associations, in their early years, operated with a particular urgency that gradually softened, over subsequent decades, into something more closely resembling ritual remembrance than active investigation, a shift several surviving members have described candidly, in later interviews, as a kind of necessary grief work, a way of accepting an unresolved loss without ever fully closing the door on it. Annual gatherings held near the anniversary of the disappearance, initially organized primarily as informal support meetings for grieving relatives still reeling from a loss, too strange and too total to process through any conventional channel of mourning, evolved over time into something closer to a quiet, recurring commemoration, drawing, in later decades, not only direct descendants but a broader circle of regional historians, researchers, and interested members of the public who had come to feel some connection to the case through years of reading and research, even without any direct family tie to the vanished town. One such descendant, a woman named Loretta Vance, whose grandmother had been among those who vanished, became, over the course of several decades, one of the most persistent and well-documented voices advocating for renewed attention to the case, conducting her own research, corresponding extensively with state archives and, later in life, federal records offices, in an effort to piece together a fuller account of what investigators had actually found and considered in those early years, much of which had never been made fully public. Her research, conducted largely through patient, repeated correspondence over a period spanning more than 30 years, succeeded in recovering and preserving a meaningful portion of the original case documentation that might otherwise have been lost entirely to administrative neglect. Scattered across multiple agencies, whose own institutional memory of the case had faded considerably by the time she began her inquiries in earnest during the 1980s. She has been credited, by several later researchers who built directly on her work, with single-handedly preserving what remains the most complete accessible record of the original 1958 investigation, a contribution that, while never formally recognized by any official body, has nonetheless become foundational to nearly every serious subsequent examination of the case. In an interview given late in her life, reflecting on decades spent pursuing answers that never fully arrived, she offered a reflection that has since been quoted often in the limited body of serious writing about the Aldridge Hollow case, a reflection that captures, perhaps better than any official report ever managed, the particular and lasting strangeness of what happened to that town. People want to imagine it as something sudden, she said, a single moment, a flash, everyone gone in an instant, like a switch being thrown. I used to imagine it that way myself, because it felt cleaner, somehow, less frightening than the alternative. But the deeper I went into what investigators actually found, the half-eaten breakfasts, the unmade beds, the kettle still warm on the stove, the more I came to believe it wasn't sudden at all. I think something moved through that town slowly enough that some of them, at least, didn't even know to be afraid until it was already too late to do anything but go along with it. I think that's the part nobody wants to sit with. Not that they vanished, but that for at least some of them, in those last minutes, it might not have felt like anything was wrong at all. This reflection touches on something that has occupied serious researchers of the case for decades, a detail that, more than the mining theories, or the federal rumors, or the disturbed grave markers, seems to sit at the very center of what makes Aldridge Hollow's disappearance so resistant to explanation. Nearly every piece of physical evidence recovered from the town points toward an event that was, in some sense, gentle in its execution, however catastrophic in its outcome. No signs of panic, no evidence of struggle, no indication that anyone in that town understood, in their final moments, that anything unusual was happening to them at all. This is, in its own way, more disturbing than evidence of violence or chaos would have been, because it suggests a kind of totality to whatever occurred, a completeness that left no room for resistance or even basic awareness, an event so thorough in its effect that it apparently overtook nearly 400 people without a single one of them managing to leave behind any clear record of recognizing what was happening before it was already finished happening to them. A handful of more recent researchers, working with techniques and resources unavailable to the original 1958 investigators, have revisited the case periodically over the decades since, generally without producing any fundamentally new understanding of what occurred, though their work has occasionally surfaced small, additional details that have added further texture, without ever adding clarity, to the case's long accumulated record. A team of researchers working in the late 1980s granted limited access to what remained of the original case file through a combination of persistent record requests and the gradual loosening of certain records restrictions over the intervening decades, noted a detail that had gone largely unremarked upon in the original investigation, but that struck them, reading the file with the benefit of 3 decades of hindsight, as significant. Several of the meteorological logs maintained by the regional weather station nearest to Aldridge Hollow, routine records kept for agricultural and aviation purposes throughout that period, showed an anomaly in barometric pressure readings recorded in the hours surrounding the disappearance, a fluctuation the original 1958 investigators had noted only in passing, attributing it to equipment malfunction given the absence of any corresponding weather event severe enough to account for it through ordinary meteorological means. The 1980s researchers, consulting with a meteorologist unconnected to the original investigation, found that the equipment in question had, according to maintenance records, been recently serviced and calibrated only weeks before the disappearance, making equipment malfunction a less satisfying explanation than the original investigators had assumed, though the meteorologist consulted was equally unable to propose any alternative explanation that fit the data, noting only that the fluctuation recorded was, in his professional assessment, unusual enough to warrant further investigation, had any further investigation of this case ever actually been pursued with the resources it would require. This same team of researchers, working through original weather station logbooks that had survived in regional archive storage largely by chance rather than any deliberate preservation effort, also noted a secondary, related anomaly that the original investigators appeared to have missed entirely, perhaps because the relevant logbook page had, by the time of the original investigation, already been filed away and was not specifically requested or reviewed in those first chaotic weeks. The station's overnight observer, whose routine duties included recording basic conditions at set intervals through the night, had noted, in the log entry corresponding to roughly midnight on the night of the disappearance, a brief, handwritten annotation outside the standard recording format, the kind of personal aside an observer might jot down in passing, without considering it significant enough to formally report through any official channel. The annotation read simply, "Temp drop felt sudden, more than gauge shows," followed by nothing further. No elaboration, no follow-up entry in subsequent logs, suggesting the observer considered the matter worth pursuing beyond that single, brief note. When the 1980s research team attempted to track down the observer responsible for that entry, they found he had passed away some years earlier, and his surviving family had no specific recollection of him ever discussing the night in question, leaving the annotation as one more small, isolated fragment of testimony that could neither be meaningfully expanded upon nor definitively dismissed. This detail, like so much else connected to Aldrich Hollow, has never been resolved one way or the other, sitting instead alongside the disturbed grave markers, the restricted search area, the persistent and uniform folk testimony from surrounding communities, as one more thread in an accumulated tapestry of unresolved strangeness that, taken individually, might each be explained away through some combination of equipment error, embellished memory, and the ordinary administrative confusion of mid-century rural bureaucracy, but that, taken together, have never quite allowed serious researchers of the case to fully dismiss the possibility that something genuinely outside the bounds of ordinary explanation occurred in Aldrich Hollow on that night in March of 1958. The physical town itself has continued to deteriorate over the decades since, the buildings left standing slowly succumbing to weather, neglect, and the occasional act of vandalism by trespassers drawn by the town's notorious history, despite official efforts to discourage and restrict access to the site. By the 1990s, most of the wood frame structures along the original Main Street had collapsed or been deliberately demolished by the county as safety hazards, leaving behind foundations, scattered debris, and a handful of more sturdily built structures, including the schoolhouse and the Baptist church, that have survived in increasingly deteriorated condition into the present day. Periodic efforts by local historical preservation groups to stabilize and protect what remains of the site have met with mixed success, hampered by limited funding and the site's persistent, uncomfortable reputation, which has made fundraising for its preservation a harder sell than it might otherwise have been for a site of comparable historical significance with a less unsettling story attached to it. The schoolhouse, in particular, has become something of a focal point for the small community of researchers and amateur investigators who continue to visit the site under whatever limited legal access remains available, given its relatively sturdy original construction and its outsized place in the folklore that has accumulated around the case over the decades, including the account of the young couple who reported seeing seated figures in its upper-story windows, years after the building should have stood entirely empty. A structural assessment conducted in the early 2000s, intended primarily to determine whether the building posed any immediate safety hazard requiring demolition, found the structure surprisingly stable for its age and decades of neglect, sound enough that county officials ultimately opted to fence off rather than demolish it, a decision that has allowed it to remain, even now, the single most recognizable and most frequently photographed structure associated with the case, its empty windows and slowly collapsing roofline a recurring image in nearly every documentary, article, and online discussion that has ever attempted to tell the story of what happened to Aldrich Hollow. A small but dedicated community of researchers, historians, and amateur investigators has nonetheless continued to maintain interest in the case across the decades, producing periodic articles, documentary projects, and, more recently, online forums dedicated to compiling and cross-referencing every available piece of documentation related to the disappearance, work that has, over time, assembled what is likely the most complete public record of the case that currently exists, exceeding in some respects the surviving official documentation, much of which has been lost, damaged, or remains restricted in ways that continue to frustrate serious researchers attempting a full accounting of what investigators actually knew and considered in those early years. This online community, loosely organized but remarkably persistent across more than 2 decades of sustained activity, has produced, among other things, a detailed digital archive cross-referencing every known account, official and unofficial, related to the case, an effort that has occasionally surfaced previously unknown connections between scattered pieces of testimony that no single researcher, working alone, might ever have noticed. It was through exactly this kind of collaborative cross-referencing, in fact, that researchers first noticed the striking consistency between the farmer's account of bells ringing from the abandoned church and several entirely independent reports, gathered decades apart and from witnesses with no apparent connection to one another, describing similar phantom sounds emanating from other structures within the town's boundaries, a pattern that, taken together, suggests something considerably more systematic than the kind of isolated, embellished anecdote that typically characterizes folklore surrounding abandoned places, though what that systematic quality might actually indicate about the underlying cause remains, as with everything else connected to this case, entirely unresolved. It is worth pausing to consider, in light of everything gathered across these decades of investigation and speculation, just how unusual the totality of the Aldridge Hollow case remains, even among other unexplained disappearances in the historical record. Most comparable cases, even the most genuinely mysterious among them, tend to involve smaller numbers of people, isolated individuals or small groups, whose disappearance, however strange, can at least theoretically be reconciled with ordinary human behavior and ordinary human vulnerability to accident, crime, or deliberate concealment. Aldridge Hollow involved nearly 400 people, spanning every age, every walk of life within that small community, vanishing in what all available evidence suggests was a single, contained window of time, with no surviving witness account from within the town itself, no communication, no warning, nothing beyond the physical traces left behind in homes that looked, in nearly every particular, as though their occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and would be returning shortly. Traces that have now sat undisturbed, in their essential outline, for well over 6 decades. The official record, such as it remains, continues to list the Aldridge Hollow disappearance as an open and unresolved case, technically still under the jurisdiction of a state agency that has not meaningfully investigated it in any active sense for decades. A kind of permanent administrative limbo that mirrors, in its own bureaucratic way, the suspended, unfinished quality of the town itself, frozen at the edge of an explanation it has never quite reached, and likely never will. The memorial marker at the edge of what was once the town's main street continues to list all 381 names. Weathered now, some of the lettering beginning to fade, maintained periodically by the dwindling number of descendant families who still make the journey out to that quiet stretch of valley to remember relatives they, in most cases, never had the chance to actually know. The annual gathering held near the marker each March has, in recent years, drawn a noticeably smaller crowd than it did in earlier decades, a natural consequence of time's passage, as the generation with direct memory of the disappearance has nearly entirely passed on, replaced by grandchildren and great-grandchildren whose connection to the case is necessarily more abstract, built on inherited family stories rather than any lived experience of the loss itself. Several of the family associations that once organized these gatherings have folded entirely or merged with the broader research community that has, in many ways, become the primary custodian of the case's memory in the present day, a transition that some surviving descendants have found bittersweet, marking as it does a kind of final passage from private family grief into something closer to permanent historical curiosity, the same transition that befalls nearly every tragedy eventually, however singular and however unresolved it remains. There is one final detail, surfaced relatively recently, within the last decade, by a researcher cross-referencing old county records as part of a broader digitization project intended to preserve fragile mid-century documents before they degraded beyond recovery. That has, since becoming known within the small community that follows this case closely, taken on an outsized significance relative to its modest place in the historical record, the way certain details in unresolved mysteries tend to accumulate weight far beyond what their evidentiary substance alone would seem to justify. Among the records recovered and digitized was a partial transcript of a telephone call placed from Aldridge Hollow's general store to the county operator at 11:47 p.m. on the night of the disappearance, a call that had gone entirely unmentioned in any of the original 1958 investigative reports, its existence apparently overlooked or lost in the chaos of that initial response, surfacing now only because the county telephone exchange had, as a matter of routine practice at the time, logged the basic details of every call passing through its switchboard, a log that had survived, improbably, in storage for over 60 years before anyone thought to examine it closely enough to notice what it contained. The researcher who first noticed the entry has described, in her own account of the discovery, the particular strangeness of realizing what she was looking at, paging through what she had expected to be a routine and unremarkable stretch of mid-century switchboard records, the kind of document she had cross-referenced dozens of times before in connection with other, unrelated research projects, before the date and timestamp on that single entry resolved into recognition. The realization settling over her, she said, with a kind of physical chill she still remembers vividly even now, years after the fact, that she was looking at a record no one connected to the original Aldridge Hollow investigation had apparently ever seen. The operator's contemporaneous notes, brief and procedural in the manner typical of such logs, recorded only that a call had been placed from the Aldridge Hollow General Store's line, that it had connected, and that it had lasted approximately 40 seconds before the line went dead, with no indication in the notes of who the caller had attempted to reach, since the connection itself failed before the operator could complete the routing. The notes include one further detail, added almost as an afterthought in the operator's own handwriting, the kind of small personal observation operators sometimes added to their logs despite it falling outside the strict requirements of the role. Beside the entry for that call, the operator had written a single word, underlined once: odd. When researchers, decades later, managed to track down and interview the elderly woman who had worked that exchange, by then well into her 90s, her memory understandably imperfect after so many years, but lucid enough to discuss the broad outline of her decades of work at that switchboard, she recalled, with what the researchers who spoke to her described as a still visible unease even after all that time, that she had noted the call as odd not because of anything said during it, since nothing had been said at all in the brief seconds before the line failed, but because of a sound she remembered hearing in the background just before the connection died, a sound she had never been able to fully describe to her own satisfaction in all the years since, except to say, every time she was asked about it, that it had not sounded like anything she associated with a hardware store, or a general store, or any ordinary nighttime activity in a small mining town she had known her whole life. It had sounded, she said, more like a great many people, all very far away, breathing in at exactly the same moment. She elaborated further, in that same interview, on a detail she had apparently never shared with anyone before, not even her own family across the many decades since that night, a detail the researchers who interviewed her have described as having visibly cost her something to finally put into words after withholding it for so long. She said that in the instant just before the line went dead, beneath that strange collective sound she had spent decades failing to describe adequately, she believed she had heard, very faintly, a single voice, closer to the receiver than whatever else she'd heard, speaking what she could not quite make out as words, but what she had always, privately, in the years since, interpreted as someone attempting, with great effort and against some resistance she couldn't name, to say a single, short sentence before the connection failed entirely. She said she had never been able to decide, in all the decades since, whether what she believed she'd heard was an actual fragment of speech, or simply the kind of meaning her own frightened mind had imposed retroactively onto a sound too brief and too strange to have carried any real information at all, and that this uncertainty, more than the sound itself, was the thing that had kept her from ever discussing the call with anyone, because she had never wanted to be the kind of person who claimed to know something she could not, in good conscience, actually swear to. no further record of that call has ever been recovered. No explanation has ever been offered for what the sound might have been, or who might have placed the call, or what they might have been attempting to report in the final seconds before whatever happened in Aldridge Hollow finished happening, completely and silently, to every remaining resident of that quiet, unremarkable town. The case remains, to this day, officially open and officially unexplained. A town of 381 people who simply stopped being there, sometime in the dark hours of a March night in 1958, leaving behind a kettle on a stove, a ledger half filled in pencil, and a single, recorded sound that no one who has ever heard a description of it has been able to forget.